We are here at the 5th Biennial Conference of Eastern European Network for the Philosophy of Science, and you came here with your presentation called The Good Informant Account of Epistemic Trust. But before we get to that, I would like to just sort of say a few words about yourself, about your research, about maybe how you got into that area of specialization or in philosophy in general.
Thanks for this interview. I'm Faik Kurtulmus. I'm a political philosopher, actually, from Istanbul, Turkey, from Sabanci University. And I've been working on a project with my colleague Gürol Özek, who is a philosopher of science. And basically what we are ultimately interested in is justice in the distribution of knowledge. We think that people's access to knowledge matters for their flourishing, for their political agency. But obviously many conditions have to be in place. The knowledge they need needs to be produced. It has to be disseminated. People should be able to trust these sources. Right? So the question then we got interested in became, well, what kind of a thing is epistemic trust, and what are the conditions for well-placed epistemic trust, right? Because you don't just want people to trust blindly or to trust sources that are not trustworthy. You want something else, right? You want people to trust sources that are trustworthy with good reasons. And then we got interested in what is epistemic trust.
Yeah, so I think the great way to start, as any philosopher does, is to create a sort of conceptual map. So can you tell us a little bit about what sort of thing is trust and epistemic trust, and maybe the relationship between epistemic trust and mere epistemic reliance?
Okay.
I think that would be a great place to start for the rest of the talk.
Yeah, great. So there's a huge philosophical literature on trust, and obviously it makes a lot of sense because we depend on it. It's one of those things where you realize how much you depend on it when it breaks down. And the classic article that got this debate started is Annette Bayer's article, in which she makes a distinction between mere reliance and trust. And the thought, obviously there's a lot of debate about the nature of this distinction, but at an intuitive level, we can say a couple of things. So imagine someone who goes to lunch at the same place at the same time, right? Let's say Ayşe, let's give her a name. Ayşe goes to lunch to a certain place every day at 2, and you want to see her. Well, you can go there to meet her at 2. Right? In that kind of case, philosophers want to say you relied on her to be there. You didn't trust her to be there. Whereas suppose you called her up, you said, well, would you like to have lunch today at 2 at this place? And she said yes. In that kind of situation, you trusted her to be there. So a couple of differences. One is trust can be betrayed. Right? If she says, I'll be there, she isn't, then she has betrayed your trust. Whereas if you just assume she'd be there because you have noticed this regularity, then you can say your reliance was betrayed, right? Likewise, when she said she'd be there, but she isn't, you can say, well, why didn't you show up? You can demand an explanation. But if you were just counting on her to be there, if you were just relying on her, you can't demand an explanation. It would be very silly. Different from reliance, trust has this relationship element. It's between two people, involves a kind of awareness of this reliance, and also it has a normative aspect. And it can give rise to what philosophers call reactive attitudes, right? If you trust someone to do something, they don't, then you can resent them. Whereas if you just rely on them to do something and they don't, you can't. It doesn't make sense. So that's the distinction between trust in general and reliance. And as I said, there is a lot of debate about what this additional factor is, right? So reliance plus some extra factor. There are different theories of what that extra factor is. What we're interested in is epistemic trust. So it's a much more narrower topic, obviously, and what we're interested in is trust in sources of knowledge. And again, it's one of those things where you realize how much you depend on others when things go wrong, right? Most of what we know, we know thanks to other people. And we learn much of it through trust, but also much of it through reliance. So the question then becomes, well, what is this difference, right? What's the difference between epistemic reliance and epistemic trust?
All right, and so it seems like it is certain. There's an analogy between trust and reliance and like justified belief and knowledge, right? We need some additional factor to
yes,
create this sort of
in that respect, richer
state.
Yeah.
All right, and so now I think it's a good time to say a little bit about your account of epistemic trust. You called it good informant account of epistemic trust. So can you say a little bit about what is the idea behind that?
Sure. So it makes sense to begin with reliance, epistemic reliance, because I think it matters a great deal, and it's actually one way in which we learn from science. Right. So Stephen John gives an account of this, which I like. He says, look, basically, usually how we learn from science is we assume that when some fact is accepted by the scientific community, there's a sociological premise involved, which is the scientific community is organized in such a way that they would accept a certain proposition only if certain epistemic conditions were fulfilled. And then he has this epistemic premise, which says, well, the epistemic reasons that scientific community relies on are good reasons, right? So usually how we come to accept some scientific conclusion is something like this, right? We don't assume that they're directly addressing us. We don't assume that they are guided by any sense of obligation towards us, right? Rather, it's kind of like an engine that runs along nicely, right? The community is organized in such a way that it's able to generate truths and generate agreement around those truths, and that's why we come to believe that. So the distinct thing then about epistemic reliance, as I see it, is that it's very impersonal, right? It's not addressed to me, the scientific claims, as a member of the public. Usually that's not the case, right? Usually they're talking to each other, scientists. Rarely do they address the public. But secondly, you don't really care about who's making the claim. Right? Rather, you assume that this is a scientist and you reason from that. You don't think this is this person, that person. Sometimes, though, we want something more, right? And that's where I think epistemic trust comes in. So when a claim is accepted by the scientific community, this gives us good reason to accept it. But sometimes there is no such agreement, right? And in those kinds of cases, you have to decide, well, should I believe this person or that person? So who's making the claim becomes important. But secondly, it's different when you're going to make some serious decision based on it, right? So some scientific claims you want to just find it out and that's it. But sometimes you really want to have additional assurance, right? So let's imagine you have a child, you're thinking whether to vaccinate your child or not, right? In that kind of case, for instance, you want some additional assurance. The good informant account aims to capture one kind of assurance that we may want and we may sometimes get. Informing is a very rich act, informing someone. Right? So one picture you might have about people learning from science, which is kind of the naive picture we also had, is there's a proposition scientists believe, they assert this, then if all goes well, members of the public believe this. But that's not how communication really works. Right? Communication depends on a very rich normative background. And the good informant is someone who does this well. So what do I have in mind? A couple of things. So teaching actually is a good example of this, right? So when you're teaching a topic, you want to introduce your students to that topic. If you know everything you know about the topic and you tell your students everything you know about the topic, you're not doing a good job, right? Rather, you have to select certain things as being worthy of their attention, right? And some things should come later, right? And there you're making a choice. And that choice depends on, one, your goal to inform your students about a certain subject matter. But secondly, it depends on your knowledge of them, right? You have to have a sense of what they already know so that you don't repeat stuff that they already know. But also, you have to meet them where they are. And that's one aspect of being a good informant, right? Selecting facts and being attuned to the knowledge needs of the person you're talking to. And this makes it a very personal thing, right? Because you are being informed by someone, and that act is governed by your knowledge needs, your competence, the kind of inferences that you can make. So one other thing that's related to a good informant is think of how, let's say, two doctors can discuss a bit of research amongst themselves and with members of the public. Let's say there's a certain chemical which doubles the risk of cancer, right? If you say this to another doctor, right, one, they would know the baseline, right? They would know, well, this is the probability of someone getting this kind of cancer. This is what its doubling would amount to. Imagine saying the same thing to a layperson who has no sense of these probabilities. So you can say this, right? This doubles the risk of cancer. But a better informant would be someone who says, look, this doubles the rate of cancer and the actual rate is this, right? So informing is always informing someone with an awareness of their needs and competences and their abilities. And the way people uptake these informative acts is also shaped by that, right? So when someone is addressing me, when someone is giving me an account of something, I assume that they are guided by certain norms and they are guided by a certain awareness of my needs, my abilities, and that's how I interpret them. So again, to illustrate this may sound a bit abstract, but it's something we always do actually. So imagine the same person saying the same thing in two different contexts. Let's say you have a doctor, you have a recent back injury, your doctor knows about your recent back injury, and you're in their office and they say to you, well, lifting weights is good for you. Right? When they say that to me in their office, when I know I'm their addressee, I can assume that even given my back condition, lifting weights is good for me. Now imagine the same person, my doctor, going on TV saying the exact same thing. Right? In that situation, I can't make the same inference. Right? Because I know they're not just addressing me, but they're addressing other people. And that fact guides how I interpret them.
It seems to me that what makes a good informant, he has or she has a certain epistemic virtues, right? Like in literature, there is a concept of epistemic empathy. You sort of understand that people might be in different places in epistemic competence, and you sort of address them within their competence. So is it something like that, or do you construe this concept of good informant within different concepts?
I'm not familiar exactly with the literature you have in mind, but it's a kind of virtue, right? That is, it's a virtue in the set of skills that require good judgment, right? So I think it's like that. Teaching is also like that, right? So it's partly that, but it's not just epistemic empathy, but also a certain kind of care. Right? Because one thing that you want to do is you also want to make sure that the person you're informing doesn't draw wrong inferences. Right? Again, that's what the doctor who says, look, this doubles your chance of cancer, but this is the baseline. Right? What they're doing is they're taking precautions by giving you additional information to ensure that you are in a good position epistemically.
So it's not only epistemic, it's also ethical.
Yes, I think so.
That's
key, I think. Yes, that's key. So we're already assuming both with epistemic reliance and epistemic trust, they have a good sense of what the facts are, right? The issue that we want to get at with the good informant account is, well, suppose someone has the conditions for being an agent that you can epistemically rely on. What else do you want? Right? And that's what the good informant account aims to capture. So we're kind of assuming the epistemic bit is sorted out in the background already. It's rather in this act of communication, what happens? What are the other things that you need?
The last question I think is worth asking is, because I read one of your paper, and then in that you proposed a certain account of trust, and there was actually a clause that the fact should be communicated should be communicated like, with humility and with responsibility and with honesty. So I wonder, what sort of difference does it make? Like you have this sort of thicker concept of a good informant, but there was already some ethical or virtue talk beforehand.
One way a couple of things perhaps. One is, you may think of this as unpacking those requirements, but also we have grown to be somewhat skeptical of sincerity as a condition, right? And the reason for that isn't that being insincere can sometimes be good. Rather, sincerity assumes that there is something that you believe and you express what you believe. And sometimes sincerity isn't enough. So I think that's important. So on some models, at least of distraction science, for instance, when these scientists are sharing their results, they're not made up results, right? They have done good science. It's just that they are misleading evidence, right? And when you present misleading evidence, you're kind of being sincere. The vice of your act is slightly different, we want to say, right? You are relying on the person you're informing to draw the wrong inferences, right? So it's the kind of opposite of being a good informant. So it's sometimes not sufficient, so you need more. That's one thing that we want to emphasize with this account. But secondly, I'm not so sure that it's necessary for the following reason. When a scientist believes some claim, it's really couched in a very different vocabulary than what lay people can understand. So there's a kind of translation going on. And in that process of translation, there is loss of information too, right? And that's how it should be, actually, to be a good informant. But then when that happens, it's difficult to say whether the scientist exactly believes that or not, because the scientist doesn't exactly think in those terms too. So one example you may want a more everyday example to think of would be thinking of a parent explaining photosynthesis to their child, right? Suppose the parent says, well, sun is food for plants, right? They don't believe this, right? But it's kind of good enough for the kid, right? Something more complicated would be difficult for them to comprehend, but they're not lying. But they're not exactly being sincere either, because it's not what they believe. So it's rather you thinking, in light of the person you're informing, their needs and their capacities, what epistemic situation should they be in? Given their needs, what's the statement closest to truth that would be appropriate for them to believe, something like that, right? It's very difficult to specify what this is, but it's not exactly them believing what you believe, right? Because sometimes with scientists, it's very difficult, right? We'll never believe what they believe, because to believe that, to understand that, would require further training. So that simplification makes the application of sincerity difficult, I think. So it's a much richer and individual relative virtue that we're thinking of.
Thank you for your time, for your knowledge.
Thank you for inviting me to do this. It's been a pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you.